How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Monday, Yom Sheni. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Yehud in South Carolina, Joe in the Inland Empire, Shendor in the Bronx, Tom in PA, Bella in Florida, Guy in Ohio, Bill in Missouri, Sharon in New Jersey, Lorraine in Texas, Nancy, North Carolina, Chaim in Florida, Lester in Florida, Lise in Virginia, Lynn in Canada, Ella in Southern California, Moshe in Brooklyn, and Reuven in Henderson, Nevada. Welcome, everybody. Double daf. That's actually going to get us a little bit ahead of schedule, but always good to have a buffer. We got a good head start on page 8 yesterday. That's why we can do the double today. So we're right near the bottom of page 8a, and today we'll be doing, God willing, pages 8 and 9 here in Tractate Menachot, the 30th volume of the Talmud, continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 2 here in chapter 1. Generally speaking, what would disqualify a meal offering? Well, if the priest himself is blemished, not standing, doesn't have his feet on the ground, uses his left hand instead of his right hand, etc., matters that would disqualify the meal offering because of the person bringing it. Yesterday we got into the discussion of did the service vessel into which the meal offering was placed in order to be measured, then the handful removed and placed in another service vessel, which would then be conveyed to the altar, and then that amount of flour poured onto or placed on the fire of the altar, and different aspects that could disqualify the offering over the course of that procedure. And once we started comparing the meal offering to animal offerings, and where that comparison breaks down, we started to digress a little bit from the priest somehow disqualifying the offering because of something lacking in him, and we're still kind of in the midst of that digression. Okay, so the Gemara continues a discussion from yesterday. Rav says that a meal offering is sanctified without its oil. Right, so the meal offering of a sinner is plain flour, right? A certain quantity of flour doesn't have neither oil nor frankincense, but most meal offerings do have oil and frankincense. So what if you omitted the oil? Does that disqualify the offering or not? Rav says that a meal offering is sanctified without its oil, and its law is not the same when a tenth of an ephah of flour is lacking, as we find such a law with regard to the showbread that stood on the table of the showbreads in the sanctuary, which is sanctified without oil and is nevertheless sanctified by a service vessel, which is the table on which the showbread sit. And similarly, it is sanctified even without its frankincense, as we find such a law with regard to the meal offering accompanying the libations of an offering, which is sacrificed without frankincense and is nevertheless sanctified. Additionally, a meal offering is sanctified even without its oil and without its frankincense, as we find such a law with regard to the meal offering of a sinner, which lacks both oil and frankincense and is nevertheless sanctified by a service vessel. Now, in this discussion, we have to keep track of what sanctified means in this context, right? If you set aside the certain amount of flour to be brought as a meal offering and then place it in a service vessel, so it's sanctified. Does that mean that if it's a type of offering that requires oil and frankincense, that you can then put the handful on the altar pyre and continue the offering as if what was lacking wasn't lacking? It doesn't mean that, right? Sanctification is a necessary step in this process that marks a milestone. If it becomes sanctified, because you designated it as flour for an offering, placed in a service vessel, okay, it's sanctified. But if it's the kind of meal offering that requires oil and frankincense, and you don't have it, That doesn't mean that you can now take the handful and put it on the altar. It's simply sanctified. You reach that step in the process, which means that if you don't get the oil and the frankincense, you're not going to be able to move forward, but you can't then just take that flour that's in the service vessel and put it back in the cupboard, right? It is sanctified. So now you have to deal with something that has become holy, has become set apart, can't return to the world of the mundane. So it doesn't mean that it's fit for sacrifice, doesn't mean that it can go forward. It just means that it's reached the stage of sanctification. So let's continue. The Gemara answers, in terms of these apparent contradictions we just mentioned, this is not difficult. No, wait, what am I saying? Sorry, I'm in the wrong place. So additionally, a meal offering is sanctified even without its oil and without its frankincense, as we find such a law with regard to the meal offering of a sinner, which lacks both oil and frankincense and is nevertheless sanctified by the service vessel. Now, Rav continues. And oil and frankincense, these items themselves, the oil and the frankincense, are each sanctified by service vessels. This substance without that one, and that substance without this one. What does that mean? Oil is sanctified on its own, right? Oil can become sanctified on its own. Why? Because there are rituals in the Holy Temple that use oil by itself. What is that? Oil is sanctified on its own, as we find such a law with regard to the log of oil of a mitzorah, right? Somebody who has tsaras, when he is cured of his tsaras, then he has to bring certain offerings to complete his purification. Part of the ritual of that is that the priest in the temple will dab some of this sanctified oil on the toe and the thumb and maybe the ear of the mitzorah, right? As we find such a law with regard to the log of oil of a mitzorah, which is sanctified on its own. Frankincense, it is also sanctified on its own. It doesn't have to be mixed with oil and flour in order to become sanctified. How do we know that? Well, we know that there's the bowl of frankincense that stood on the table of the showbreads in the sanctuary. Frankincense is sanctified on its own, as we find such a law with regard to the frankincense that comes in the bowls that are brought with the showbread. There is no oil in that case, and yet the frankincense is sanctified in the bowls, right? We need the service vessel, but it doesn't need to be mixed with oil. And Rabbi Hanina says, and now we're on page 8b, neither is this substance sanctified without that, nor is that sanctified without this. Rather, okay, frankincense on its own for the showbreads on the table. Okay, oil on its own for the mitzorah. But when we're talking about oil and frankincense to be mixed with flour in a meal offering, that's a different situation, right? That's a totally different situation. And that's why Rabbi Hanina says, no, this doesn't become sanctified by itself, and that doesn't become sanctified by itself. Rather, any meal offering that requires oil and frankincense is sanctified by a service vessel only when the flour, oil, and frankincense are all placed in the same vessel at the same time. So the Gemara asks, and according to the opinion of Rabbi Hanina, for what purpose was the vessel that measured a tenth of an ephah anointed, making it possible for it to sanctify items placed inside it? The vessel was fashioned only for measuring flour, right? Not flour mixed with oil, only flour. So doesn't it sanctify flour by itself? This vessel was fashioned only for measuring flour, and according to Rabbi Hanina, the flour is not sanctified without oil. What then does the vessel sanctify? The Gemara answers, the vessel was anointed for the purpose of sanctifying the meal offering of a sinner, which does come without oil and without frankincense. But regular meal offerings, the flour has to be mixed with oil and frankincense, according to Rabbi Hanina. The Gemara notes, and Shmuel also holds in accordance with this statement of Rav, that a service vessel sanctifies the flour of a meal offering even without its oil. As we learned in a Mishna in Zevachim 88a, the last tractate we studied, the vessels used for liquids sanctify only the liquids, and the vessels that serve as dry measures sanctify only the dry goods. But the vessels used for liquids do not sanctify the dry goods, and the vessels that serve as dry measures do not sanctify the liquids. This would seem to suggest that, okay, you sanctify the flour in a cup used for dry measure, you sanctify the oil in a cup used for wet measure, and then you mix them in yet another service vessel, right? That seems to be implied, but let's keep reading. And Shmuel says, with regard to this Mishnah, they taught that vessels used for liquids do not sanctify dry goods, only with regard to vessels used as measures, right? They had different kinds of service vessels in the temple. Some were used for measuring, and some were used for sanctification, right? So the measures, the ones that were just used for measuring, so, those cups there were some for dry measures, flour by itself. There were some wet measures, oil by itself. But there was a different kind of service vessel that was used for sanctifying a mixture. And what was that? A mixing bowl. But bowls that are used for collecting and tossing the blood of offerings sanctify the dry goods as well, as it is stated with regard to the offerings of the princes brought during the inauguration of the tabernacle. You recall that each tribe sent an identical gift, this many service vessels weighing that many shekels and these many animals, etc. So each tribe sent a bunch of animals to be used as offerings during the inauguration of the temple, but they also sent service vessels that remained in the tabernacle and used as the service vessels of the tabernacle for hundreds of years. Right. So as stated with regard to the offerings of the princes, right, the prince of each tribe, brought during the inauguration of the tabernacle, quote, both of them full of fine flour mixed with oil for a meal offering. That's Numbers 7:13 in the Torah, which indicates that the bowl sanctifies meal offerings which are dry. Now the Gemara continues its proof. And Rav Acha of Difti said to Ravina, with regard to this derivation of Shmuel, and Rav Acha of Difti said to Ravina, with regard to this derivation of Shmuel, but the meal offering of the verse is also considered a liquid, as it is mixed with oil. How then can one derive from it the law with regard to items that are entirely dry? And Ravina said to him, the verse cited by Shmuel is necessary only to teach that the dry part of a meal offering, that is the frankincense, which invariably does not come into contact with the oil, is sanctified by the bowls as well. So the Gemara concludes its proof with regard to Shmuel's opinion, and if it enters your mind that Shmuel holds that a meal offering is not sanctified by a service vessel until all of its components are together in the vessel, meaning that when you're just measuring the flour in a measuring vessel, it has not yet become sanctified, then how can you find a case where the dry parts of a meal offering are by themselves? Is it not correct that when meal offerings are sanctified, all of them are liquids in the sense that they are mixed with oil? So rather conclude from here that Shmuel holds that this substance may be sanctified without that one. And if you wish, say instead, in answer to Rav Acha of Difti's question, a meal offering, even when it is mixed with oil, is, in comparison to the blood of an animal offering, considered a dry item. Accordingly, one may derive from the verse that the bowls sanctify dry items, and just as a bowl sanctifies a meal offering that contains oil, as it is considered dry in comparison to the blood of an animal offering, so too it sanctifies a meal offering that is entirely dry, i.e. that contains no oil, the meal offering of a sinner, as claimed by Rav. Next topic. The Gemara discusses the matter itself. Rabbi Elazar says, a meal offering from which the priest removed a handful while inside the sanctuary is valid. Inside the sanctuary? Why would we think that a meal offering that the priest removed a handful while he's standing in the sanctuary wouldn't be valid? He's obviously within the confines of the temple when they were doing this in the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, or within the confines of the tabernacle courtyard, either in the desert or when the tabernacle was located in Shiloh. Right? We were only concerned if he pulled out the handful when he's entirely outside the courtyard, right? Away from the courtyard of the Holy Temple or of the tabernacle. Why would we think it's not valid if he's in the sanctuary, like closer to the center of holiness? Well, there are certain things that don't happen in the sanctuary, right? Like you can't bring the blood of a regular sin offering into the sanctuary. That would disqualify it. We learned that. So perhaps pulling out the handful while inside the sanctuary would also disqualify an offering. And what they're saying is, no, it just has to be done within the confines of the temple. If you're even in a place of greater holiness like the sanctuary, that will not disqualify a meal offering because you pulled out the handful while standing in the sanctuary. Why? Let's see. Right? So Rabbi Elazar says, a meal offering from which the priest removed a handful while inside the sanctuary is valid, despite the fact that the handful should be removed in the courtyard, not in the sanctuary, right? Before a priori, right? Before the fact, like that's the way it should be done. But after the fact, if he did it while standing in the sanctuary, it's nevertheless going to be valid. And the reason is that we find a similar case in the sanctuary with regard to the removal of the bowls of frankincense from the table of the showbread. Just as the bowls permit the showbread for consumption, right? They can't eat the showbread. The priest can't eat the showbread until the bowls of frankincense that accompany them on the table in the sanctuary are removed from the table and taken to be burned on the external altar. That's going to permit those loaves that have been sitting there for a week and yet miraculously remain fresh to now be taken off the table and permitted for consumption by the priests who are serving in the Holy Temple that week. So just as removing something permits, right, a meal offering in a sense that the showbreads are like a meal offering, right? They're made of flour. Removing the bowls of frankincense permits them for consumption, and that happens in the sanctuary by extension or by analogy and making a legal extension. If you remove the handful from a meal offering while in the sanctuary, that's going to permit the remainder for consumption. Rabbi Yirmiyah objects. He raises an objection to this opinion from a Baraisa discussing the verse, quote, and he shall bring it to Aaron's sons, the priests, and he shall remove from there his handful. Leviticus 2:2. So the verse indicates that the removal of a handful from a meal offering may be performed from the place where the feet of the non-priest may stand. That's anywhere in the temple courtyard, but a non-priest cannot stand in the sanctuary. So the Baraisa continues, Ben Beseira, who holds that a handful is not disqualified when removed with the left hand, says that the verse should be interpreted as follows. From where is it derived that if one removed a handful with his left hand, that he must return the handful to the vessel that contains the meal offering and again remove the handful with his right hand? The verse states, and he shall remove from here, or he shall remove from there. And this indicates that, right, so why are we talking about Ben Beseira in the left hand? Because they're based on the same verse. He shall remove from there. The verse states, and he shall remove from there. And this indicates that the handful is removed from the place where he already removed it, i.e. the handful is returned to the meal offering and thereupon removed from the same meal offering, this time with the right hand. Now, it is clear from the statement of the first Tana that the handful of a meal offering may be removed only in the place where the feet of a non-priest may stand, to the exclusion of the sanctuary. Now, some say that Rabbi Yirmiyah raises the objection and then he resolves it. And some say that Rabbi Yaakov said to Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Tachlifa, I will explain to you the resolution of this objection. The verse is necessary only to permit the entire temple courtyard for removing the handful there, not to prohibit the removal of a handful inside the sanctuary. And the reason is that you should not say Since a burnt offering is an offering of the most sacred order, and a meal offering is likewise an offering of the most sacred order, then just as a burnt offering requires that its slaughter be performed in the northern part of the temple courtyard, so too a meal offering requires that the removal of its handful be in the northern part, right? And we don't hold that way. So the Gemara raises a difficulty with regard to this comparison. How can you compare a meal offering, even if you're going to say it's of the most sacred order, to a burnt offering, which has its own particular needs? What is notable about a burnt offering? It is notable in that it is more sacred, as it is consumed in its entirety upon the altar. Can you say the same about any meal offering? No, only the handful is burned on the altar. So the Gemara responds that the same comparison may be drawn from a sin offering, which is also an offering of the most sacred order, and therefore has to be slaughtered in the northern part of the courtyard. And yet it is not slaughtered in its entire, it is not sacrificed in its entirety on the altar, right? It's not consumed by the altar. Part of it is consumed by the priests. And yet it must be slaughtered in the northern part of the temple courtyard. So why do we say that the handful has to be removed from a meal offering in the northern part of the courtyard? So now the Gemara says, how can you compare a meal offering to a sin offering? What is notable about a sin offering? It is notable in that the laws of a sin offering are more stringent, as its sacrifice atones for those sins whose transgression causes one to be liable to receive charis. And the Gemara responds, okay, well then the comparison may be drawn from a guilt offering, as it too is an offering of the most sacred order. It is not sacrificed in its entirety upon the altar. It does not atone for the same kinds of sins as a sin offering, and yet it is a requirement that it be slaughtered in the northern part of the courtyard. So why do we say that the handful of a meal offering can only be removed in the northern part of the courtyard? And the Gemara says, no. You can't make that comparison, because what is notable about a guilt offering? It is notable in that a guilt offering has a loftier status, as it is one of the types of offerings whose atonement is achieved through their blood, i.e., it is an animal offering. And the Gemara adds, well, once this claim has been accepted from all of them as well, i.e., from the burnt offering and the sin offering, same thing. Those are achieved through animals that have blood offerings. So does that mean that none of it can be compared to the meal offering? As they are all types of offerings whose atonement is achieved through their blood. So rather, the verse was necessary in order to permit the removal of a handful anywhere in the temple courtyard, because it might enter your mind to say that since it is written, and it shall be presented to the priest, and he shall bring it to the altar in Leviticus 2:8, and it states, and he shall remove from there his handful in Leviticus 2:2, one might have thought to claim, just as the bringing of the meal offering is in the southwest corner of the altar, so too the removal of the handful must also be performed in the southwest corner. Therefore, the verse teaches us that the removal of the handful may be performed anywhere in the temple courtyard, and we do not have a verse that excludes the sanctuary. Therefore, since it can be performed anywhere in the courtyard, and the sanctuary is in the courtyard, removing the handful can also happen in the courtyard. Now, the Gemara discusses the matter itself. Rabbi Yochanan says, peace offerings that were slaughtered in the sanctuary are valid, right? We saw that in Tractate Zevachim. Burnt offerings, sin offerings, guilt offerings, they have to be slaughtered in the northern portion of the temple courtyard. A peace offering can be slaughtered anywhere in the courtyard, and that includes inside the sanctuary, or on the roof of the sanctuary, or on the altar itself. Right? We had that whole discussion in Tractate Zevachim. Rabbi Yochanan says peace offerings that were slaughtered in the sanctuary are valid, as it is stated, and slaughter it at the entrance of the tent of meeting. This means in the courtyard, and it is logical that the law with regard to the minor area, i.e. the courtyard, should not be more stringent than the law with regard to the major one, the tent of meeting or the sanctuary. Meaning if it's valid in the courtyard, obviously it's going to be valid in the sanctuary. So the Gemara raised an objection to the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan from a Baraisa. Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira says, from where is it derived that if Gentiles surrounded the temple courtyard and were firing projectiles inside to the point that it became impossible to remain in the courtyard on account of the threat that the priests enter the sanctuary and partake of the offerings of the most sacred order and the remainders of the meal offerings while inside the sanctuary. Can you imagine that they were having this discussion 1,500 years ago and saying, what if it's raining missiles on the Temple Mount so that it's too dangerous for the priests to be outside in the courtyard where they would normally consume the edible portions of offerings, that they may therefore take refuge inside the sanctuary and they can eat those portions there. And they're going to, derive a proof that they can do that in that dangerous situation. It's amazing sometimes, the foresight that the sages had. Now, maybe they were thinking more about catapults and, rocks that are raining into the courtyard. They had such a phenomenon when Nebuchadnezzar was laying siege to Jerusalem. Later, when the Romans were laying siege to Jerusalem, maybe even burning, rocks or bundles of, gas, oil-soaked stuff that was like burning projectiles. They weren't obviously talking about guided missiles, but still, interesting that they were having this discussion. Now we move on to page 9a. So how do we know that they may partake of the remainders of offerings inside the sanctuary in this condition of danger? The verse states, every meal offering of theirs, and every sin offering of theirs, and every guilt offering of theirs, which they render unto me, meaning God, shall be most holy for you and for your sons. In the sanctuary shall you eat them. Sounds like a direct permission for them to eat it in the sanctuary from Numbers 18, verses 9 and 10. And this indicates that, although the mitzvah is to consume offerings of the most sacred order in the courtyard, in certain instances, the priest may consume these offerings inside the sanctuary, despite this being a place of elevated holiness. Now, the Gemara explains why it's brought this objection into our discussion, but according to the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan, why do I need this verse? Let him say here as well that the verse states, in the court of the tent of meeting they shall eat it, i.e. in the temple courtyard, and he's saying that includes the sanctuary, so why would the Torah need a verse to say they can eat it in the sanctuary? The argument is suggesting that, well, if there's a verse that allows them to eat in the sanctuary, then in the absence of such a verse, they may not perform an action in the sanctuary, like removing the handful from a meal offering. Right, i.e. in the temple courtyard, then it is logical that the law with regard to the minor area should not be more stringent than the law with regard to the major one, i.e. if one may consume a peace offering in the temple courtyard, then all the more so he may consume it in the sanctuary. That would be in the absence of a verse, but we have a verse, so then what? So the Gemara explains, consuming an offering is not the same as slaughtering it, right? Removing a handful is like slaughtering. Eating is a different kind of action. Eating the remainder of offerings takes place after the sacrifice has already been completed, right? The owner has already received atonement or the priest has effected acceptance, so that the owner, if he vowed to bring a meal offering or he vowed to bring an animal offering, he has fulfilled his vow. Or if he was bringing a sin offering, he has effected atonement once the blood is sprinkled or the handful is removed and then burned on the altar. Eating the remainder is an important part of the process, but it is not indispensable to effecting atonement, right? So that's why consuming is different than slaughtering. Consuming is different than sacrificing. Right? Consuming an offering is not the same as slaughtering it. The slaughter of an offering is part of the sacrificial service, and it is not considered disrespectful for a person to serve his master in the place of his master, i.e., within the sanctuary as well as in the courtyard. Therefore, we say that the law with regard to a minor area should not be more stringent than the law with regard to the major one. But, by contrast, with regard to the consumption of an offering, since a person may not eat in the place of his master, right? Let's face it, a servant or a slave is not going to eat at the dinner table along with his master, right? We are servants of God. We don't eat at God's table. Our table is God's table because everything is God's table. But we don't, whip out a napkin, tuck it in our shirt and our knife and fork and have a picnic on the altar, Right? That's inappropriate for us to be eating there, all the more so inappropriate to be eating in the sanctuary. By contrast, with regard to the consumption of an offering, since a person may not eat in the place of his master, the only reason that it would be permitted to consume an offering inside the sanctuary during those times of danger is that it is written in the verse, in a most holy place shall you eat them. And had this not been written in the verse explicitly, we would not say that the law with regard to a minor area should not be more stringent than the law with regard to a major one. We would say that. Next topic. It was stated if one mixed the oil of a meal offering into it outside the wall of the temple courtyard. Okay, so we're saying if we sanctified the dry flour by measuring it, and we sanctified the oil by measuring in their own service vessels, now we're going to mix these things, but we're going to do the mixing outside the courtyard. Have we now disqualified the offering? It was stated, if one mixed the oil of a meal offering into it outside the wall of the temple courtyard, Rabbi Yochanan says, disqualified. And his colleague and debate partner, Reish Lakish, says, it's valid. Reish Lakish says, it is valid, as it is written, and he shall pour oil upon it and put frankincense upon it in Leviticus 2:1. And then it is written, and he shall bring it to Aaron's sons, the priests, and he shall remove, etc. So Reish Lakish explains, the sages derive from here that from the removal of the handful onward, the rites performed with the meal offering are solely a mitzvah of the priesthood. Accordingly, the verse taught about pouring and mixing, that they are valid when performed by a non-priest. And from the fact that the priesthood is not required from the mixing, it may be derived that it is also not required that its performance should be within the courtyard of the temple. But Rabbi Yochanan says this meal offering is disqualified, since a meal offering's performance is in a service vessel. Therefore, granted that the priesthood is not required, yet in any event, its performance inside the temple courtyard is required because use of service vessels is in the courtyard. So the Gemara notes that it is taught in a baraisa in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan. If a meal offering was mixed by a non-priest, it is valid. But if it was mixed outside the wall of the temple courtyard, it is disqualified. And generally speaking, when Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, right, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, disagree with each other, generally the law follows Rabbi Yochanan. He was the senior member in that friendship. And he was Reish Lakish's teacher before Reish Lakish became his colleague. Now, it was stated with regard to a meal offering that became lacking in its full measure before the removal of the handful. Okay, so imagine the flour was sanctified in a service vessel. The right amount is there. But before the priest comes and takes the handful out of it, somebody knocks somebody bumps into him and some flour spills out. So now the measure is lacking. It was sanctified in its service vessel, but before the handful was taken out, the measure became lacking because some of the flour fell out. Then what? So Rabbi Yochanan says that the owner shall bring additional flour from within his home and shall fill the missing part of the measure of this meal offering. We can top it off. But Reish Lakish says, no, he shall not bring flour from within his home and fill it. Instead, he must bring a whole new meal offering, because once it went in the service vessel, it became sanctified. If then some of it fell out so that the measure was incomplete, he's going to have to start over, bring a new meal offering. The Gemara explains, Rabbi Yochanan says that he brings flour from within his home and tops it off, as the removal of the handful establishes it as a meal offering to the extent that it may become disqualified. Before the removal of the handful, one may always add flour to the meal offering if some of it fell out. By contrast, Reish Lakish says he shall not bring flour from within his home and fill it, as the sanctity of the service vessel establishes it as a meal offering. Therefore, once the meal offering was placed in a service vessel and sanctified, if some of the flour fell out so that the measure was lacking, it is disqualified. Rabbi Yochanan raised an objection to Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, i.e. Reish Lakish, from a Mishna in Tractate Negayim 1410, which was discussing the log of oil brought by a mitzora for his purification. In a case where the log lacked a full measure, if it became lacking before the priest poured from it into his palm in order to place it on the right thumb and big toe of the mitzora, so then the priest shall fill it. You can top it off. Clearly, the service vessel containing the log does not sanctify the oil to the extent that it can become disqualified if some of it falls out. And the Gemara notes, indeed, this is a conclusive refutation of the opinion of Reish Lakish. Next topic. It was stated with regard to the remainder of a meal offering that became lacking between the removal of the handful and its burning upon the altar. Okay, now the handful has been taken out. Right? Now the handful has been taken out. It's placed in a service vessel, and that handful in its service vessel is on its way to the altar to be burned there. Now there's the remainder from which he took the handful that's still in its service vessel. Right? Once the handful is burned on the altar, what's in the remainder is now going to become edible by the priest or even by the owner in certain cases, depending on the type of meal offering that's being brought. But there needs to be, that remainder in the service vessel. What if some or all of it became either missing or disqualified, blemished, rendered tameh, etc.? After the handful was taken out, but before the handful was burned, then what? So it's stated with regard to the remainder of a meal offering that became lacking. Okay, so in some way it became lacking. Between the removal of the handful and its burning on the altar, Rabbi Yochanan says that one burns the handful on account of such remainder, and that the remainder is then permitted for consumption, what's left of it. And Reish Lakish says that one does not burn the handful on account of this remainder that is lacking. And the Gemara notes, according to the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, everyone agrees, meaning Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish agree that the handful is burned on account of the remainder. When they disagree, it is concerning the law according to the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua. Right? We need more information. When do they disagree and say that the handful can't be burned? If just a little bit spilled out or something more significant? Let's see. So the Gemara cites this dispute that we're now alluding to. As we learned in the Mishna on page 26 of this tractate, if after the handful was removed, the remainder of the offering, of the meal offering, became tameh, so all of it is tameh, or if the remainder of the meal offering was burned, it was destroyed, or if the remainder of the meal offering was lost, then, according to the principle of Rabbi Eliezer, who says that with regard to an animal offering, the blood is fit for sprinkling, even if there is no meat that can be eaten, the meal offering is fit, right? So even if the remainder is entirely lost, according to Rabbi Eliezer, we would still take the handful and burn it on the altar. It doesn't matter that the remainder was lost. But according to the principle of Rabbi Yehoshua, who disagrees with Rabbi Eliezer, he says that with an animal offering, there has to be some meat left. Right, some meat left, either to burn on the altar or to be eaten by the priest in order to sprinkle the blood on the altar. But if all of the animal was somehow destroyed, then we don't sprinkle that blood on the altar. And likewise, if you remove the handful from a meal offering, and then all of the remainder is either ruined, right, rendered tameh, impure, or lost or burned, if all of it is therefore gone, then we don't burn the handful on the altar. But if some of that meal offering remains, then we do burn the handful on the altar. Right? But according to the principle of Rabbi Yehoshua, who says that with regard to an animal offering, the blood is fit for sprinkling only if there is meat that can be eaten, then here, where all the remainder of a meal offering was destroyed or lost, it would be unfit, and the priest would not burn the handful. As the handful serves to do what? Render the remainder permitted. I mean, that's not the only reason it's being brought. It actually affects acceptance on the altar. But since it also has the function of rendering the rest edible, permitted for consumption, if there's nothing left to consume, we don't put the handful on the fire. according to Rabbi Yehoshua. Now, the one who disqualifies the remainder of a meal offering that became lacking between removal of the handful and its burning upon the altar, i.e. Reish Lakish, he holds in accordance with the plain meaning of the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua. And the one who deems the remainder fit, i.e. Rabbi Yochanan, maintains that when Rabbi Yehoshua says that the remainder is unfit, he says so only there in a case where nothing remained from the meal offering other than the remainder. Since the handful is intended to render permitted for consumption the remainder of the meal offering, if there is no remainder at all, then the handful is not burned. But in a case where there remained even a little bit of the remainder, Rabbi Yochanan maintains that even Rabbi Yehoshua would concede to Rabbi Eliezer that the handful is fit to be burned. Right? So Rabbi Reish Lakish interprets Rabbi Yehoshua to say that if any of the remainder is lost, we don't burn the handful. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, what Rabbi Yehoshua is saying is, as long as some is left, we can burn it, but if all of it is gone, then we don't. Now, the Gemara cites a proof for Rabbi Yochanan's position, and again, we follow Rabbi Yochanan. So it is clear that this is Rabbi Yehoshua's opinion, as it is taught in a Baraisa that Rabbi Yehoshua says, with regard to any of the offerings that are mentioned in the Torah, from which there remains either an olive bulk of meat or an olive bulk of fat, the law is that the priest sprinkles the blood of that offering and thereby permits either the remaining meat for consumption or the remaining fat for sacrifice on the altar. As long as there's that minimum measure in olive bulk, then we're going to sprinkle the blood on the altar. But if there remains less than the minimum measure, only half of an olive bulk of meat and half an olive bulk of fat, then he does not sprinkle the blood, as the consumption or burning of anything less than an olive bulk is not significant enough to warrant the sprinkling of the blood. The volumes of the meat and the fat do not combine, right? So we don't combine a half olive bulk of meat with a half olive bulk of fat. We need at least an olive bulk of either one in order to permit to continue the blood, in its journey to be sprinkled on the altar. Now the Baraisa continues, and in the case of a burnt offering, even if there remains only half an olive bulk of flesh and half an olive bulk of fat, he does sprinkle the blood, because in a burnt offering, it all goes up on the altar, meat and fat together. So as long as we have combined meat and fat, that minimum measure of an olive bulk, that's enough to be a significant placement on the altar of the burnt offering, and therefore it's significant enough for the blood to be sprinkled on the altar. I.e., as the flesh and fat are both burned upon the altar, there is in fact an olive bulk of the offering that is designated for burning on the altar. And with regard to a meal offering, even though it remains entirely intact, he shall not sprinkle. He shall not sprinkle. If it's entirely intact, why wouldn't he sprinkle? Now we're on page 9b. So the Gemara asks, what is the mention of a meal offering doing here in a Baraisa that discusses slaughtered offerings? There is no sprinkling of blood in the case of a meal offering. Why are we talking about meal offering? Rav Papa said the Baraisa is referring to a meal offering that accompanies the libations. You might have thought that in the case of a meal offering that's not being brought by itself, it's just an accessory to an animal offering, that even though the meat of the offering was lost, something happened and it was lost or destroyed, but the accompanying meal offering remains, that therefore you would sprinkle the blood, since the blood hasn't been sprinkled yet. But this teaches us that no, the fact that the accessory offerings have not been, harmed in some way is irrelevant, because the blood of an animal offering requires that the animal still be there, enough of it either to be consumed by the priest or consumed by the altar. If all of the meat of the animal offering is gone, you don't sprinkle the blood on the altar. Rav Papa elaborates, it might enter your mind to say that since such a meal offering comes with a slaughtered offering, it is considered like the offering itself. Accordingly, if the only part remaining from an offering is the meal offering that was brought with it, perhaps it is considered as though part of the offering itself remains, and therefore the priest may sprinkle the offering's blood on account of it. Therefore, that Baraisa teaches us that this is not the case. In any event, Rabbi Yehoshua states in this Baraisa that the blood of an offering is sprinkled if a minimum amount remains from it. The same should apply for a regular meal offering which is brought by itself. right? So as long as some of the meal offering remains, we should be able to burn the handful that's removed from the meal offering. Now, Rabbi Yochanan cited this baraisa as proof that even according to Rabbi Yehoshua, if a portion of the remainder of a meal offering remains intact, then the handful that was removed from it may be burned on account of it. The Gemara asks, and concerning the one who disqualifies the handful, that would be Reish Lakish, he would disqualify it if any of the remainder is lacking. So how does he explain the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua? Right? Rabbi Yochanan says, no, Rabbi Yehoshua says you can sprinkle the blood if any of the meat, if at least a minimum portion of the meat left, and therefore with a meal offering you can burn the handful as long as some of the meal offering, at least presumably a minimum measure of the meal offering, is left. Why does Reish Lakish says, no, you need the entire remainder of the meal offering, not just a minimum measure? How does he explain the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua? So Reish Lakish would claim that it is different here in the case of a meal offering. As the verse states, and the priest shall remove from the meal offering its memorial part, and shall make it smoke upon the altar. Since it is clear that the verse is discussing a meal offering, the apparently superfluous mention of the meal offering in this phrase teaches that unless the entire meal offering is intact, the priest shall not burn the handful. So what's the Gemara going to do next? Say, well, how would Rabbi Yochanan answer Reish Lakish's very reasonable sounding argument? And the other Amora, Rabbi Yochanan, how does he interpret that verse? Rabbi Yochanan claims that the phrase from the meal offering is referring to a meal offering that was already whole at the time of the removal of its handful. And the verse teaches that he shall burn its handful even though after the handful was removed, some of it fell out. Doesn't matter that the remainder is no longer whole, that it is now lacking, as long as it was whole when the handful was removed, as long as some of the remainder is left, he can burn the handful. So Rabbi Yochanan raised an objection to Reish Lakish from a baraisa. And as usual, when we state a baraisa, we might state more information than is relevant to us. Let's keep track why this baraisa is being brought by Rabbi Yochanan. If before the priest detached the arrangement of showbread and the bowls of frankincense from upon the table in the sanctuary, the bread broke into pieces, the bread is unfit for consumption, and the priest does not burn the frankincense contained in the bowls on account of it. And if the bread broke after the priest detached it from the table, so the bread is unfit for eating by the priest, but the frankincense, which when it was taken from the table, the loaves of bread were whole, it can now be burned on the external altar. The bread is unfit, but the priest burns the frankincense contained in the bowls on account of the bread that was whole at the time that the bowls of frankincense were removed. And Rabbi Elazar says the baraisa does not mean that the priest actually detached the showbread. Rather, it means that once the time to detach has arrived, the frankincense contained in the bowls may be burned, even though he has not yet detached it. Just as the frankincense contained in the bowls is burned despite the broken showbread, likewise the handful of a meal offering should be burned even when some of the remainder is lacking. Reish Lakish answered Rabbi Yochanan by saying, in accordance with whose opinion is this? It is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, who permits the burning of a handful even when the remainder has been entirely destroyed. And I hold in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua. Rabbi Yochanan said to him, I am stating a complete halacha, a complete law to you, i.e. a baraisa of an unspecified opinion, and you say to me that this baraisa is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer by himself? Do we follow Rabbi Eliezer? Isn't that a minority opinion? Rabbi Yochanan added, and furthermore, if the baraisa is in accordance with the opinion of only Rabbi Eliezer, then why does the baraisa mention specifically an instance when the bread broke? According to Rabbi Eliezer, even if the bread was burned or lost entirely, he deems the frankincense contained in the bowls fit for burning as well. And the Gemara notes, Reish Lakish was silent and did not respond to the objections of Rabbi Yochanan. Sounds like he said, oh, I see. But the Gemara now comes to the aid of Reish Lakish and says, but why was Reish Lakish silent? Let him say to Rabbi Yochanan that one cannot cite a proof from a baraisa that discusses the showbread, Because that's a communal offering. Because offerings of the community are different. Since ritual impurity was permitted for them, right? If all the community is, or more than half of the community is tameh, and more than half the priests are tameh, or all the priests are tameh, then we can still bring communal offerings, but we would not bring individual offerings. So there are some leniencies that apply to communal offerings that don't apply to individual offerings. Therefore, it was also permitted to sacrifice them when they are lacking. In the case of a communal offering, are we going to learn out from that something about an individual offering, which is more stringent? Rav Ada bar Ahava said the fact that Reish Lakish did not respond in this manner is to say that a meal offering that is lacking in measure is considered like a blemished animal, not merely like an impure offering. And there is no instance of a blemished animal being permitted for use as an offering, even the case of a communal offering. Very interesting to say that some of the flour spilled out of the service vessel that contained the remainder of a meal offering after the handful is taken out. Now the Gemara is suggesting that we're going to compare this meal offering that is lacking because some fell out, not to, an incomplete offering that some of it got harmed in some way, but rather a blemished offering. And if an animal become blemished, well, then you don't sprinkle its blood on the altar and you don't bring it on the altar. And the Gemara, and so the Gemara relates that Rav Papa was sitting and saying this law, and he noted that Reish Lakish was silent and did not respond to Rabbi Yochanan's objections by differentiating between a communal offering and that of an individual, and that Rav Ada bar Ahava derived from Reish Lakish's silence that a lack in the measure of a meal offering is tantamount to a blemish. Well, Rav Yosef bar Shemaiah said to Rav Papa, are we not dealing with a disagreement that exists between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish? Even in the case of the Omer meal offering, they have the same disagreement where they're both talking about a communal offering. And even so, they disagree. Accordingly, Reish Lakish could not have responded to the objections of Rabbi Yochanan by distinguishing between a communal and an individual offering, and therefore one cannot derive from his silence that a meal offering lacking in its measure is like a blemished animal. Rav Malkiyu says that one Baraisa taught, the verse states, and he shall remove of its fine flour. This indicates that if the meal offering lacks any amount, it is disqualified, and the priest may not remove a handful from it. Similarly, the term of its oil teaches that if the meal offering lacks any amount of its oil, it is disqualified. And it is taught in another baraisa that the verse states, but that which is left of the meal offering shall be Aaron's and his sons. And this teaches that the remainder of the meal offering is given to the priests only if there was initially a whole meal offering. Before the handful was taken out, it had to be complete. But this is to the exclusion of a meal offering that was lacking, or whose handful was lacking, or from which the priest did not burn any frankincense. In such cases, the meal offering is disqualified, and its remainder may not be consumed by the priest. Seemingly before the handful was taken out, it's disqualified if it's lacking. Now, Rabbi Malkiyu asks, why do I need two verses to disqualify the meal offerings that are lacking? Is it not correct to say that one verse is referring to the meal offering that became lacking before the removal of the handful, i.e. that one may not refill it, and the other verse is referring to the remainder of the meal offering that became lacking after the removal of the handful and before the handful is burnt on the altar? This would be support for Reish Lakish, that if any of the remainder spilled out, right, if it became lacking in any way, even though there was more than a minimum measure left there, but if any of it was spilled out and it became lacking its full measure, that we don't burn the handful, right, because it's now disqualified to the extent that we don't burn the handful. This argument supports Reish Lakish. And so Rav Malkiyu concludes, and if it is so, then this would be a conclusive refutation of the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan in both instances where he disagrees with Reish Lakish. In the case of a meal offering that became lacking before the removal of the handful, as Rabbi Yochanan holds that one may refill it, and in the case of the remainder that became lacking between the removal of the handful and its burning, as he holds that the handful may still be burned. Nice try, Rabbi Malkiyu, but the Gemara says no. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. Gemara says no. One verse is indeed referring to a meal offering that became lacking before the removal of the handful, fully disqualified. But we may refill it according to Rabbi Yochanan. But it is not teaching that the meal offering is disqualified. Rather, this verse indicates that if he brings flour from his home and fills it so that the meal offering is no longer lacking, then it becomes fit again. But if he does not bring more flour, then it is not fit. If you remove the handful from a service vessel in which the original full measure, some was lost, and then you remove the handful, no way. Now it's fully disqualified. You can't burn that handful. You can't do anything with this meal offering. It's sanctified and disqualified. And the other verse is indeed referring to the remainder of the meal offering that became lacking between the removal of the handful and its burning upon the altar. Nevertheless, it does not indicate that the handful may not be burned. Rather, it teaches that even though the priest burns the handful on account of such a remainder, that remainder is prohibited for consumption. We burn the handful, but if some of it, the remainder, was lost between the removal of the handful and the burning of the handful, then it is unfit for consumption. It's fit enough that we can burn the handful, and the person who was bringing the meal offering can achieve atonement. But in terms of the subsequent procedure, depending on the kind of meal offering, whether the owner eats of it or the priests eat of it, they don't eat it if the remainder became lacking, according to this verse and according to this view. And the Gemara continues, this is indeed the appropriate explanation of the verses, as a dilemma was raised before the sages, according to the statement of the one who says that in a case where the remainder of the meal offering became lacking between the removal of the handful and its burning on the altar, the priest burns the handful on account of the remainder. Concerning the remainder itself, what is its status with regard to consumption? May the remainder be eaten if it became lacking after the handful was removed? And Zeri said that the verse states, but that which is left of the meal offering shall be Aaron's and his sons, which teaches that the priest may consume the remainder of the meal offering, but not the remainder of the remainder, right? The remainder of the meal offering means the full measure, except for the handful taken out. If it's less than that, they can't consume it. Alternatively, Rabbi Yanai says that of the meal offering shall be Aaron's and his sons, indicates that the priest may consume only the remainder of a meal offering that was previously whole when the handful was burned, not the remainder of a remainder. Okay, that's what I've got for us. Yeah, that's what I've got for us today. Let me just take a couple of questions. Sharon. Is the meal offering put on the altar after the mixing in the service vessel placed loose on the altar, or does it get burned on a vessel on the altar? Just trying to get a visual of the process. I think it's burned, like they pour it out of the service vessel onto the altar pyre. Now I don't remember. I remember that there was a special place for that. On the altar. It might even be a separate fire for that purpose, but now I'm not confident. I'm going to have to get back to you on that. Okay. Tom, was there a maximum amount of flour or oil that you could bring? Yeah, what fits in the service vessel for the type of meal offering, right? It could be heaping, but it can't be more than what that service vessel would hold. And Stephen, so what do we do with the meat that is left over from making a stroimel? You're speaking yeshivish to me. No. Strymel in the Gemara. It's telling me what's about a strymel. No. Gemara Menachot. What's a stroimel? I'm sorry. I don't know what the word stroimel means. This is the problem when you don't have a guy with great Hebrew teaching you. What do we do with the meat that is left over from making a stroimel? I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to look this up. But you know, if we're talking, I mean, the context that we're talking in is that after, you know, the animal is slaughtered, it's shechted, the blood is collected by a priest in a service vessel, it's on its way to the altar, and then something happened to the animal. And I think maybe what you're asking me is, okay, according to the opinion, let's say that the animal became tameh, right? So now we can't sprinkle the blood. Or even, you know, if we've sprinkled the blood and then that meat became tameh, so it can't be eaten. So what are we going to do with it? So that would go out to that designated place of burning, right? For offerings that became tameh and can't be eaten by the priest. In the case of an olah, they can't go up on the altar as a burnt offering. You know, in the case of a sin offering, it can't be eaten by the priest. So there was that special place designated for burning of disqualified offerings. And then depending on the disqualification, there were actually 3 different areas where there was the burning. If it became tameh within the courtyard, there was a place of burning in the courtyard of the temple, not on the altar, but in a place in the courtyard. If it left the courtyard, then there was a place for that within Jerusalem. And if it left and became disqualified, or it was going to be used, you know, to be offered up, you know, the person had intention to offer it up on a private altar, then there was a place for burning that outside the walls of Jerusalem. There was more nuances to it than that, but that's what I recall at this moment. That's what I've got for us today, and with God's help, see you tomorrow, Tuesday, at the regular Tuesday time, 6 p.m. Pacific. All the best.